All
Okay,
right, good evening, everybody. It's good to see each one of you. It's great to be back, and I'm excited to be able to share this message with you. And so we're going to go ahead and go right into it. But before we do, I want to provide a little bit of context, some foundation as to where we left off before we go right into tonight's story. So in First Samuel chapter 31, verses 1 through 3, and then verse 6, we come towards the end of the story in regards to King Saul and Jonathan. We see here that it's titled The Death of King Saul and Jonathan. And so verse 1 tells us that now the Philistines attacked Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them. Many were slaughtered. And unfortunately, verse 6 tells us that King Saul and his three sons, which included Jonathan, and if you remember, that was David's best friend, his armor bearer, and his troops all died together that same day. Well, when David heard about the news about King Saul and Jonathan's death, he was devastated. I think it's interesting to see, though, that he wasn't just devastated about Jonathan's death, he was also devastated about King Saul's death. Even though King Saul had been so mean to him and had tried to kill him so many times, he still had respect for his father-in-law. He still had love for him. Well, we see down here, and if you were to continue reading through the chapters, you would see that a civil war erupted in Israel, where you had King Saul's troops fighting David's followers. And this civil war lasted for many years. So David didn't even get to become king right away after King Saul's death. And yet David continued to be patient. And at some point he was he was in charge of certain parts of Israel, but it wasn't until here where we come in 2 Samuel chapter 5 that David finally becomes king of Israel. And we're just going to read a little part in there. So verse 3 tells us that there in the city of Hebron, King David made a covenant before the Lord with all the elders of Israel, and they anointed him king of Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king and he began to reign, and he reigned for a total of 40 years. And so now we're going to go into the story. And it was during this time as king where David makes a big mistake. You see, he falls into temptation and he ends up committing some big sins against God. And that's what we'll be talking about tonight. So you can find this story about David and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel chapter 11. We're going to read verses 1 through 18 and then verse 22. So let's begin. So in the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent his commander named Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and they laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, after he took his nap, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of his palace. So King David had a palace, and then he had the rooftop where it was flat. I can imagine like patio furniture up there and like just a really nice place where you can just look over and see the city. And that's what we see here. As he looked out over the city, he noticed that there was a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. Verse 3 tells us David sent someone to find out who she was. And he was told, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. Then she returned home. Verse 5. Later, when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she sent David a message saying, I'm pregnant. Whoa. So yeah, that's exactly what we read. David slept with Bathsheba, who was married to Uriah. He got her pregnant, and now he's receiving the message that she is in fact pregnant. Now, I want to point out a few things as we go into the story, and I want us to break it down little by little. First of all, I want to point out the fact that King David wasn't where he was supposed to be. He was supposed to be in battle, not at home. How do we know this? Because the verse that we read says that in the spring, when kings normally go out to war, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. So you see, oftentimes temptation will come to you when you're at a place where you're not supposed to be, or where you probably shouldn't be. For example, and I put here some kind of dramatic examples, like being at a bar, being at a club or a strip club, or maybe it could be something not as dramatic. Maybe you're at a friend's party or just at somebody's house. And so for some of the younger viewers here, some of you that are teenagers and still in high school, this is the reason why sometimes you ask your parents if you can go to a party and they tell you no. And they tell you no, not because they want to be controlling, not because they're telling you that they don't trust you. It's because they know that if you go to a party, there might be some things there that might tempt you to do something you shouldn't, or it might put you in danger or at risk for something bad to happen. And so that's why sometimes parents will tell you, no, you can't go to that party or that quinceañera. And now some of our older viewers or adults and college age people, you don't have your parents telling you what you can and can't do now, right? You have the freedom and the choice to do what you want. If someone invites you to go to the club or say, hey, let's hang out, let's go to the bar, you don't have to check in with your parents. And we all have the free will to make that choice. But it's important to keep in mind here that when you go to places where you shouldn't be, or a place where you're not supposed to be, as such it was for David, you can be exposed to temptations and you can be exposed to certain risks that maybe you wouldn't be if you were just at home. So let's continue on. So I want to point out something very, very important here. When it comes to temptation, you always have a choice, either to give in or to get out. And what I mean by that is either you have the choice to give into the temptation or you have the choice to get out of that situation. And God promises to always provide us a way out so you can resist any temptation you may face. I'm not making this up. You can see it right there in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 13. It says, God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so that you can endure. So sometimes getting out of the temptation situation can literally mean you having to walk out, or in Joseph's case, having to run out, like running away from the situation. For example, and we don't have time to go over Joseph's story, but you can find this in a great example where Joseph was faced with the temptation of sleeping with his master's wife, because at the time Joseph was a slave in Egypt and he was working for this army general named Potiphar. Well, his master's wife really liked Joseph. And just this part right here zeroes in on that moment where Joseph was faced with the temptation. Verse 12 says this: she, which was Joseph's master's wife, she came and she grabbed him by his cloak. And back then, remember, their clothes that they would wear was kind of like a robe looking thing. It was a cloak. You would just kind of tie it or wrap it around your body, kind of like a toga. And so here she grabs his cloak, demanding him, come on, sleep with me. And Joseph was like, no way, like that, you're my master's wife. And he tore himself away, like he pulled himself from her and he ran out of the house. And in doing that, because it was just kind of wrapped on his body, and she grabbed onto him so tight, it like unwrapped it. He took off running naked, and it just was a bad situation. It looked really bad. But Joseph did the right thing. He resisted the temptation. He did not sleep with his master's wife. And if you're interested in reading that story, You can find it in Genesis chapter 39. But the reason why I bring it up is that sometimes the temptation can come all of a sudden and you can be overwhelmed by it, that there's nothing more for you to do than have to remove yourself from that situation. And that means sometimes just walking out of that room where the temptation's at. It means literally sometimes just running, just getting away from it. It means turning off your phone, maybe. It means turning off your computer. It might mean changing the channel. Whatever it may be, it's just removing yourself from that situation. But other times, temptation doesn't come so sudden like that. Sometimes temptation comes creeping up to you little by little in baby steps, to the point where you don't even notice that this temptation is coming at you. You think it's something you can handle and you have control over. And yet we will see here how David didn't just fall into the temptation. He took steps. He made certain choices that led to him doing two big sins against God. So let's continue and see what happened. So as I pointed out, as for King David, it was a series of his choices. It wasn't just one bad choice that David made. It was a series of choices that led into him giving into temptation. And so we're going to go back to the story we just read, where David sleeps with Bathsheba, and we're going to break it down little by little, step by step. So let's go over it right here in bold. As David looked out over the city, he noticed that there was a woman of unusual beauty, and she was taking a bath. So let's pause right there. King David, when he went out there, I don't see any evidence that he was out there trying to be like peeping Tom, like he was trying to see what he could see. No, he just went out there. It was a beautiful evening. He was just looking over the city, wanted to enjoy it. I don't see any evidence of him having intentions to put himself in a situation where he was going to be tempted. And yet it's when he's out there with his guard down, just looking over the city, admiring it, that he notices this beautiful woman and she's taking a bath. And so he's tempted at that moment. And so when we pause, what could David have done different? Well, instead of him taking more and more steps towards what he ends up doing, if in fact, when he saw Bathsheba and he liked what he saw and he said, man, I'm in the mood now, all he had to do, because he's king, was he could have just called for one of his wives. In the Bible, it's clear that David had at the very least 3 wives. He was able to get Michal back, and then he still had 2 more that he married when he was on the run. And on top of that, David had concubines, because kings in those times had those. And what is a concubine? A concubine was a woman that wasn't technically your wife, but she lived in the palace with you, and you could have sex with her whenever you wanted. That's what concubines were. King David had several of them. So instead of him following through with Bathsheba, all he had to do, if he really was in the mood, was call for one of his wife or concubines, and he could have slept with them, and it wouldn't have been a sin because it was his wife. Yet that's not what happened. So we hit the play button back and we go. So David then, after he sees her, he sent someone to find out who she was. Who's that beautiful woman I just saw? And the servant told David, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So let's pause right there. Okay, so David finds out that the woman that he's seen bathing is married. She's married to Uriah. So David could have stopped there and he could have thought to himself, as I put here, oh man, she's married. Well, that's too bad. I don't sleep with married women. So you know what? I'm not going to sleep with her. And then, as we just established right above, David could then, if he was really in the mood and wanted to have sex, all he had to do was call for one of his wives and he could have slept with them. All he had to do was call for a concubine and he could have slept with her. And yet, we know that's not what happened. The next thing David did, once he found out that she was married and that her name was Bathsheba, is that he sent messengers to go get Bathsheba and to bring her back to the palace. Let's pause there. David could have, at that point, just had a friendly conversation with Bathsheba. And after he had a friendly conversation with her, he could have been like, great, all right, go ahead and send her on her way. So I envision this like this. Bring me Bathsheba. So she comes up. Hi, what's your name? Oh, my name's Bathsheba. Wow, Bathsheba, I think you're very beautiful. Oh, thank you. So are you single or are you married? Well, I'm married. Oh, you're married? Yes, I'm married to Uriah. Oh, okay, so what does your husband do? Well, he's a carpenter, but right now, actually, he's a soldier in your army and he's fighting in battle right now. So he's out of town fighting for the Israelites. And I think if he would have had that conversation, David would have taken a step back and been like, oh, wow, Uriah is a soldier fighting for my army. And then David could have made the choice and be like, well, that's great to know. Please thank your husband for his service. I think you're a beautiful woman. Let him know that he's lucky to have you. And if you guys ever need anything, let me know. I'm here. I can help you. And he could have sent Bathsheba on her way. There would have been no sin, no falling into temptation. And the story would have gone in a whole other direction. But that's not what happened. David didn't have a friendly conversation with Bathsheba and then send her on her way. Hit the play button again. We find out that when Bathsheba came to the palace, King David slept with her. He slept with her knowing that she was married. And so now we're not going to hit the pause button. We're hitting the stop button here. We see that King David fell into temptation. King David committed a big sin, and that sin is called adultery. What is adultery? I went in and looked up the definition for you guys. A quick Google search tells me that the definition of adultery is the following. Adultery is voluntary sex between a married person and a person who is not his or her spouse. And so that fit perfectly in the definition. Bathsheba was married. David slept with her. David was not Bathsheba's husband. Therefore, it's adultery. Well, David's falling into temptation led him to sinning directly against God. Well, how so? Because adultery is prohibited in one of the 10 commandments. And the 10 commandments were given to the people of Israel by Moses hundreds of years before David was even born. So David knew that this was a commandment he wasn't supposed to break. And I'm not making this up. If you wanted to see, you would find out that the 7th commandment clearly says, you shall not commit adultery. And you can find that in Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. So we see here that taking small steps in the wrong direction can lead you to falling into temptation. This is very similar, like when you're taking small steps towards the edge of a cliff. Doing that can lead you to falling off that cliff. And let me just illustrate that for you a little bit more clear. So you're standing here, right? The edge of the cliff is over here, right? Now, you can say, I'm not going to go this way. I'm going to go the opposite way. I'm going to go towards inland, right? And the more steps you go this way, the further you get from the edge of the cliff. But instead, if you say, well, I'm here, the edge of the cliff is over there. Wow, I'm curious. I wonder what it looks like. I wonder how deep the fall is. So you start taking little steps. Oh, I can get closer, and you get closer. And you get closer, and then pretty soon you're right on the edge of the cliff, and you're like, wow, I wonder how deep the fall is. And then you're leaning forward, and at that point, it doesn't take much for you to fall off that cliff. It could be a small shove, it could be the wind, it could be the ground where you're standing can go like just kind of fall apart. And all of a sudden, you took all these small steps towards the edge of the cliff because you were curious. And now you find yourself falling off that cliff, off the edge, falling into your death. In the same way, if we take small steps in the wrong direction, we can be leading ourselves into where we would fall into temptation. So just keep that in mind. Well, the story doesn't end there. When David found out that Bathsheba was pregnant, he went into what a lot of us do. He went into a cover-up mode. Oh man, I made a mistake. I need to cover this up. I need to lie my way out of it. I need to take steps so that no one finds out what I just did. And so let's see how David tries to cover up what he did. Verse 6 says that when David sent word to Joab, who's Joab? Joab is David's commander. He sent this word to Joab, his commander. He said, send me Uriah the Hittite. Who's Uriah? Uriah is Bathsheba's husband. So he tells his commander, send me Bathsheba's husband. So Joab sent him to David. When Uriah arrived, David asked him how Joab and the army were getting along and how the war was progressing. Then he told Uriah, you know what? Why don't you just go home and relax? And David even sent a gift to Uriah after he left the palace. But verse 9 tells us that Uriah didn't go home. Instead, he slept that night at the palace entrance with the king's guards. The next day, when David heard that Uriah had not gone home, he summoned him and he asked, what's the matter? Why didn't you go home last night after being away for so long? And look at the way Uriah replied to him. Verse 11 says that Uriah replied, the ark and the armies of Israel and Judah are living in tents right now, and Joab and my master's men are camping in the open fields. How could I go home to wine and dine and then sleep with my wife? I swear that I would never do such a thing. So we see that David's cover-up plan failed because David was hoping that what Uriah would do is he would go home, relax, that he would sleep with his wife that night. So then that way, when Bathsheba would tell him that she's pregnant, Uriah would think that it was his kid. Yet Uriah's words, as we read them, and his actions show us that David underestimated the kind of man that Uriah was. You see, Uriah was a man of good character. You see that when he says, how can I relax and sleep with my wife when all my fellow soldiers are out there in battle? So we're going to pause there. I think that at this point in time, David could have made some different choices. At this point in time, after Uriah didn't go and sleep with his wife, David could have decided to do the right thing. He could have told Uriah the truth. He could have even apologized to Uriah. Could have said, hey, look, man, I kind of made a big mistake. I slept with your wife. She's pregnant now. I'm really, really, truly sorry. I really wish I wouldn't have done that. But I want you to know that I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to take care of her. I'm going to take care of this baby. I promise to financially support you guys. You know, David could have been like, hey, you know, that little small home you're at, we're going to get you guys in a big house. We're going to get you guys close to the palace because at the end of the day, this baby is a prince because he's my son. And if there's any way I can make your life easier, please let me know. But that's not what David did. He didn't tell Uriah the truth. He didn't apologize to him. He didn't offer to take care of the unborn baby. Instead, David tried to cover up his mistake again. And let's see how he does that. Verse 12 tells us, David tells Uriah, well, stay here today. Why don't you stay here at the palace? He told Uriah, and tomorrow you can return to the army. So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem that day and the next. Then David invited him to dinner and he got him drunk purposely. David wanted him to get super drunk. But even then, he couldn't get Uriah to go home to his wife. Again, Uriah slept at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. You see, David's plan was like, oh man, maybe if I get him super drunk, then he's not going to know what he's doing and he'll just stumble and get his way to his home. He'll end up sleeping with his wife. And then at that point, he'll think that the baby's his. But no, we see that Uriah, even though he got drunk, he didn't stumble or walk his way home. He slept there on the floor near the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. So at this point, King David is getting desperate. And it's in his desperation to cover up his mistakes that he commits another big sin against God. And we'll see how that plays out. We'll continue reading verse 14. So the next morning, David wrote a letter to his commander Joab, and he gave it to Uriah to deliver it to him. The letter instructed Joab the following. Here's what the letter said. It said, I want you to station Uriah on the front lines where the battle is the fiercest. Then pull back so that he will be killed. Yes, you read that right. Verse 16, so Joab assigned Uriah to a spot so close to the city wall where he knew that the enemy's strongest men were fighting. And when the enemy soldiers came out to fight, Uriah the Hittite was killed, along with several other Israelite soldiers. Then Joab sent a battle report to David, and the messenger went to Jerusalem and he gave the complete report to David. And this is what he said. The enemy came out against us in the open fields, and as we chased them back to the city gate, the archers on the wall shot arrows at us. Some of the king's men were killed, including Uriah the Hittite. Verse 25, here's King David's reaction to the news. Well, tell Joab not to be discouraged, David said. You know, the sword devours this one today and that one tomorrow. Let's just fight harder next time and we'll conquer this city. And so you see here that David's reaction was just like he didn't care. He was trying to play off that he wasn't excited by the fact that Uriah had died. And so he was just like, oh, okay, encouraging his commander, you know, you guys just keep fighting. We'll win the next one. Don't worry about it. Yet we'll see here how Bathsheba reacted. Verse 26. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him, which tells me she cried for him, which tells me she loved him. And yet when the period of mourning was over, David ended up sending for her, and he brought her to the palace and he married her. She became one of his wives. And then she gave birth to a son. But the Lord was very displeased with what David had done. You see, God knew what happened. And next week, we will learn about how David's sin is exposed and what happened as a result. But I want to point out here that because David took a series of small steps in the wrong direction, he eventually fell into the temptation. David had several opportunities to remove himself from the situation, and yet he chose not to. And as we discussed, he could have even made different choices that would have led us all to it, or led him to a different outcome. Instead, by the end of this story, we're left with a pregnant married woman, a dead husband, and a king who thinks he got away with this mistake because he covered it up. And so in conclusion, I want to point out something to you guys before we finish. And this is a point I think is very important, and I think that all of you should consider and take to heart. And the point is this: never put your eyes on a person, because people are flawed and they make mistakes. Instead, you need to put your eyes on God and on his word. And if you do that, you will never be disappointed, because God doesn't make mistakes. God is not flawed. God is perfect. God's love is perfect. God's love never disappoints. God's love never betrays. And I want to point out something to you. This David, the David that slept with the married woman and then tried to cover it up by getting her husband to sleep with her so that he could think that it was his baby. And then when that didn't work, this David decided that it would be best for the husband to die, so that way he would never find out about what happened. And yet that's the same David we've been talking about all these weeks. This is the same David we've been saying how great he is. And I put right here so many examples to point that out to you. I mean, this is the David who was anointed by the prophet Samuel to be king rather than his older brothers, right? This is the David we've been talking about who defeated the giant Goliath with just a stone. This is the David who was undefeated in all his battles against his enemies. This is the same David who showed patience when King Saul gave away his promised wife to another man. This is the same David we've been talking about who did not use self-defense when King Saul tried to spear him to death. And this is the David who did not take revenge on King Saul, even though he had two different chances to do so. We see here that even though David was a great man, even though David was a righteous person, he was a flawed one too. He was a person who made a big mistake. And in making that big mistake, he sinned against God. And that's why it's important that we never put our eyes on people, on man, on a person that you know, because that person is a human being. Therefore, they're imperfect. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to disappoint you. And at some point, they're going to let you down. And that's why we have to put our eyes on God. That's why we have to put our trust in the Bible, because it never fails. And that's why I think this is such a great and important story about King David. Even though it was a mistake that he made, a terrible one, it shows you too, it humanizes David. It shows you that David was a human being too, that David fell into temptation, did something he shouldn't have, and then tried to cover it up. And in doing so, he made it worse and worse for himself. And I like to remember that, because a lot of times we get caught up in thinking about how great a person is and how wonderful they are when they speak about God and how they're a great leader. And we forget that that person is a human being, that our leaders in government are human beings, that our leaders in our church are human beings, that will make mistakes, that will fall into temptations, that will maybe betray someone. And so with that, I'd like to point out that there are pastors and even church leaders that are going to fail from time to time. It just is what it is. It has happened, and it will happen, and it will continue to happen, because by our nature, we're imperfect. But God and his word will never fail. So we don't put our faith on them. You don't put your faith on pastors. You don't put your faith on church leaders. You don't put your faith on brothers and sisters that go to church every Sunday. No, you put your faith in God, and you put your faith in his words, which you can find in the Bible. And so remember that. And in me saying that, I want to include myself as well. I'm a human being. I'm someone who has made mistakes. I'm someone who will probably make mistakes in the future. And never would I give this message pretending to be someone that's never fallen into temptation. I would never present this story to you guys and act like I've been a perfect person. No, I'm flawed. I've said things I wish I probably didn't say. I've probably done things that, looking back, maybe I shouldn't have done. And yet I don't allow those imperfections and those mistakes to keep me from serving God. No, instead, I do my best to serve him. And I've asked for forgiveness. I've repented from some of the mistakes that I made, and God has forgiven me. And the wonderful thing about the word of God and about God's mercy is that when he forgives you, he completely wipes it away, to the point where it's as if it never happened. And you can let it go as something that God has forgiven you in the past. You continue moving forward and getting closer to him. And so I hope that in listening to this lesson, we don't put our trust in others and church leaders and people that talk about the word of God, but instead we put it in God. And that we remember here the story of David, that when temptation comes creeping, you can take steps in the right direction, not steps towards the edge of the cliff of temptation. And so with that, I'd like to conclude. In our next message, we will be seeing how God exposes David's sin. He brings it to light because the word of God says that anything you do in darkness, sooner or later, God brings it to light. And we're going to see how David reacts when his sin gets exposed. And finally, we will talk about what consequences David has to deal with for falling into the temptation we just talked about. I hope this message finds you all well. I hope it's one you can remember and hold close to your heart. And I hope that you can apply it in your life. It's been great having you all here. May God bless each one of you. And I look forward to seeing you all next week because it's going to be a great one. Take care. Bye-bye.